Awesome job, Timmons, keeping us on time. And great job, everybody, in bringing forth some really provocative, thoughtful information about this whole phenomena that I spoke to. And again, to re-emphasize, there are cascading effects that could be very profound to just the way things are in New England relative to the data that you were presented to today. And so I want to start this discussion. I'm only going to ask one question, so the rest has to come from you. So I give you a little bit of a minute or two to sort of form questions. It was sort of there's an underpinning of a presumption about the efficiency of the markets and things that are essentially warping those markets or changing those markets. And you talked a little bit about the FEMA information and its shortcomings. I'd like you to, anyone really, to expound on that. I mean, what we saw, and it was presented in Lynn's presentation, an effort to make more transparent to the coastal communities or coastal property owners the actual issue. The presumption here is with more information, we will get more rational decision making. And I guess I want to get your insights as to what that means and where you see states, you said New York and Rhode Island are moving forward on that, what that might mean if in our place, given we seem to be a leader in that. Does anybody have a orientation on, one, FEMA's maps that are backward, and maybe expound a little bit on what that means, and I could, under this special area. There's something called the Shoreline Change Special Area Management Plan in Rhode Island, and there's something called Chapter 5. I could go into those provisions, but I will in terms of you, after you guys address that point. Better information, more efficiency. Do you see that as being an opportunity to somehow more, over time, have a correction what would seem to be a warped market situation as we speak? So I'll let anybody spend a little more time with those issues. Do you want to take a shot at that?
Absolutely. Well, I think better information is a necessary but not sufficient condition, is how we would think about it. Without better information, there's no way for markets to be efficient. If we make information accessible and understandable, then, that will, I think Matthew can speak to this more, that does move markets in some parts, and for some people, is it going to get us all the way there? I personally don't think so, but it's an open and careful question.
Any other? Anything around New York when those FEMA maps are, what are they doing more so? Yeah, I think you have to get closer to the mics to be able.
I'll largely concur with Lynn here. We have some evidence in New York City where they have, which has experienced both catastrophic flooding in the form of Sandy and is a relatively highly educated, highly informed place where polling shows that people believe in climate change and information intervention appears to be effective there. Even there may be limits. We've tried to model, for example, whether there's an effect of the proposed Big U seawall around the southern part of Manhattan. The sample of single-family homes affected is quite small, but we're not able to discern any positive effect on home prices from the Big U. There have also been, NOAA and some academic groups have drawn some forward-looking flood maps. These are not legally binding, don't affect premiums, but are Googleable. And we're not finding strong price effects from those either. So targeted information interventions under certain circumstances do appear to work. They are, as Lynn says, necessary but not sufficient.
Do you have anything to add? I was going to add a sort of a political question to all of you. And I think it speaks to all your presentations. And I'm going to ask you to get out of your field a little bit and put on a political hat. Based on what we heard this morning in the paper, legislation introduced to allow communities to give tax breaks to homeowners who want to raise or build seawalls, raise their homes or build seawalls. What effect would that have on this whole dynamic? That's an adaptation strategy to still raise it up or build a wall. If we start subsidizing that, what would you see happens? Are we less efficient? Most probably, I would guess. But
I think the efficiency question is interesting. There's no, so this would sort of fall in that, I think, in a very broad, general sense, a similar impact of the subsidy to adaptation. So the subsidy coming through the tax system instead of directly applying for a grant. Then in terms of efficiency, in some sense, FEMA, there are lots of reasons for welfare to introduce FEMA aid, and there's welfare improvements from that. But in some sense, it's also introducing this distortion where we now invest less in adaptation capital. And then the subsidy is designed to counteract that distortion. So if that subsidy was perfectly counteracting, then we would expect adaptation capital to be the same as it is without the FEMA. Since we actually see adaptation capital being higher than without the FEMA, then that suggests in some sense that we are introducing a new distortion into the economy by creating kind of more adaptation than would be there in terms of distorted. I don't know if that's...
Any other comments on that? That idea that I just was surprised to see it happening today.
Our public finance professors would be very cross with us if we didn't point out that the efficiency consequence of a subsidy like that depends not only on to whom the subsidy goes, how it's targeted, but also how the funds for the subsidy are raised. And in most actual government settings, as opposed to academic models, the funds for a subsidy are raised via some kind of distortionary tax. So if we are distorting a market and creating a big inefficiency in order to get money and then hand it to somebody to raise their house on stilts, it may or may not be efficient.
We have Hello. We have about 10 minutes left. I'd like to bring in the audience at this point for any questions they've got before we have our first coffee break. So who has a question? I'll just go to the closest possible person.
Thanks so much. Hi, Paul Rosolie from the Borough of the Land Trust and a bunch of other nonprofit environmental groups. So maybe you've already answered it, and I apologize for asking it, but I want to hear it. So when does all of this reach a critical point where it just doesn't become acceptable, either politically or financially, emotionally, morally, to do the adaptation, to do whatever, whether it be stilts or walls, or is there a point in any of your calculations, your formulas, your whatever that says there's no sum game here, it's time to quit?
Yeah.
Here's your first unanswerable question.
Yeah,
First of many.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
I'm sure open to anybody.
You know, there's so many things in these models that can lead us to predict when the change will happen. We see, for example, in our work that expectations about long-term FEMA policy have a huge effect on what property values are today. So that's from the model's perspective. But going door to door and talking to people who have homes in the flood zones, you know, some of the people I spoke to were in tears when they thought about flood maps being redrawn because their property values and, you know, as Tim had said, their retirement savings are at risk. And you have people who, you know, it's not as simple as, well, the risk is coming, so now I'm going to leave and we're just going to abandon this area. I think for a lot of people, their savings are at stake. If the price drops, you know, heaven forbid they're underwater on a mortgage, it becomes even harder to leave. So I think there's a lot of factors that make it very complicated for us to predict, let alone say how we should get out of these risky areas.
Skip Hobbs, I'm representing the Council of Scientific Society Presidents today. But I was a coastal homeowner. My family had a home in Stonington, Connecticut, right at the entrance to the harbor. And I can tell you the efficiency of the FEMA maps on the market price was overnight. When the maps were redone, our 150-year-old home that had survived the 38 hurricane was just put in the zone. It just touched it. I actually had it resurveyed. The house was for sale at the time. The family decided we were going to move on. The house was for sale for $1.7 million. When the map was published, we got a notice. The price dropped to $1.2 million in a week. And the reason for that was, in the zone, if you do any modifications to the house, we were 14.5 feet above mean sea level. The people who ultimately bought the house had to raise it to 16 feet and put all the utilities out of the basement upstairs. So the market in Stonington was extremely efficient. We and others experienced the same thing. Our little yacht club had also been put in the flood zone. A poll was taken. Now, it's a well-educated community, The entire club membership was polled. There was a 70% response to that poll, which is outstanding. 90% of the respondents agreed to form a climate task force on how to protect the club from rising sea level. So people are responding in coastal communities.
So I think if I may potentially or just raise the question, I don't know if we would necessarily think that it's sufficient for something to happen so drastically, right? Because flood risk isn't changing the day the new flood maps are released. It's just that people pay attention and their information changes. So we would want, the least we can do is for these price changes to occur more gradually so that people, like you and your family don't have these kind of sudden wealth shock risks. That, flood risk is changing gradually, so should our information, then things would be smoother and not, quite so sudden and severe.
Hi, thanks so much. My name's Katie. I'm coming from Yale University. I've been really interested in your work as sort of looking at price effects as a proxy for people's perceptions of risk. And I'm curious whether any of your work touches on or whether economics has any tools to offer us for assessing how people are forming these risk perceptions in the first place, and what sorts of institutions might be mediating how they're creating these risk perceptions.
This is sociology.
Devin, do you want to go for it?
No, I don't have the answer.
Is that sort of outside of the purview of what you're interested in, I guess?
No, that's extremely important and interesting, but I don't know anything about it.
That's what you do as sociologists.
Hi, I'm John. I'm a grad student in sociology here. Hopefully this won't be outside your wheelhouse, but what I'm hearing here is information is really crucial. But what Kurt told us is that property tax is also very important here. So have any of you seen in your research any way of getting around the disincentive that communities have not to have their housing prices drop and not just kick the can down the road? It's something I work on in my research, and I'm wondering if you can give me any sort of leads or ideas from your perspective.
Come on.
Well, and that also
Speculate a bit.
gets into the question of politics. I mean, of course, you can, the temptation, right, to want to maintain these property values for the sake of everyone whose savings are at stake, for the sake of property taxes. There are so many reasons why we would want to kick the can further down the road. How do we get out of this? This is way above my pay grade for sure. But I think a smoother adjustment is perhaps the least we can do to avoid this risk of sudden, right, devaluations of properties and sudden loss of property tax base and then sudden loss of revenue to fund adaptation and mitigation. So I think that's the best way to hope for.
I have just to clarify, when you were out surveying folks, some you said who were away were more conscious of the risk, or more accepting of the risk. Those who were closer, who owned the property, were less so. Do you see that as a driver? Those who have already brought the risk into their mindset, being very reluctant to see property somehow, we have to somehow subsidize that coastal property in terms of credits or adaptation subsidies. Do you sense a conflict there when you were talking to people? Were they like, those stupid people live along the coast, they should get their butt out of there, and I don't want to subsidize them being there, and we all know that? Did you sort of pick up any political issues in those conversations? Because you're one of the few people who's gone out and actually talked to people and had data on that. Or it's just fine. They're going to lose their shirt.
I don't know if IRB would permit me to share stories and anecdotes, but at the time we did the first wave of surveys was in February 2017, right after President Trump's inauguration, and there were a lot of mixed communities, and there was so much palpable tension about so many things. People who would tell us that they stopped Christmas caroling at each other's homes, and people who tried to pump us information and say, what does John down the road think? I stopped talking to him. So, there were a lot of tensions, and yes, some people did have, hard feelings. Also, some people who live by the shoreline said, I feel really bad. I don't think I should be, I should be living here. I don't think my insurance should be subsidized. And so there was some awareness of that, but as part of a much bigger set of issues that.
wanted to say something to this question of how we fix the political incentive. There's an excellent book by a journalist, Jeffrey Dell, called The Water Will Come. He's got some anecdotes about realtors in Miami who threatened to have his head for broaching the subject of climate change. So the incentives of beneficiaries from a low information regime are really a problem. How to fix that, I tend to want to absolve myself of responsibility for that. It's tempting to prescribe higher information for voters, but there are a lot of moving parts in between a voter's information set and the responsible politician. You might try institutional fixes that would lengthen the time horizon of politicians, longer terms, but more plausibly, I think we need a political movement that actively seeks to get politicians and realtors to face up to the long-run changes that are happening in coastal communities.
This will have to be the last question so we can stay on schedule.
I'm Beth Fussel here at Brown. A lot of the focus of disaster recovery policy is on homeowners. And in fact, after Hurricane Katrina, there was a big study by the GAO that came out saying that the Stafford Act and other federal emergency management policies have really paid all their attention to homeowners and none to renters. And renters are really impacted because they have the least amount of claim on living in the place where they were affected, their home. And so, so what I'm interested in finding out from you all is whether there's similar research as to what you're doing that would address the concerns of renters. And they're an important segment of the population because they are more disadvantaged. And so the consequences of these events for that population, the rental population, is going to be fairly different than what we're talking about now. We're talking about homeowners who are more advantaged in terms of wealth.
Thank you.
Any responses to the rent versus ownership and what your models may say about that? Behavioral ones?
So I think they're to broaden the question a little bit too. It's also important to look across just income generally, and to to what extent is FEMA aid more helpful to lower income households, whether they be renters or owners or that type of thing. Those distributional concerns are really important.
There's research on it.